The orange glow of sunset was fading when Staff Sergeant James Cooper pulled into the parking lot of Phoenix Central Storage Complex. His black coffee, still steaming in the cup holder, would be his loyal companion for the next 8 hours. At 32, Cooper wasn't expecting to be working as a night security guard, but life had other plans. The warehouse district stretched out before him like a maze of concrete and steel. Large buildings cast long shadows across the empty streets, and the distant hum of the city seemed to fade away in this industrial pocket of Phoenix. Cooper adjusted his security uniform, making sure his flashlight and radio were secure on his belt. The weight felt different from his military gear, but at least it was familiar. "Evening, Bill," Cooper called out to the day shift guard, a retired police officer who was gathering his things in the security office. The small room was barely bigger than a closet, with 2 metal chairs and a desk covered in security camera monitors. Bill looked up and smiled. "Right on time as always, Cooper. Military habits die hard, huh?" "Some habits are worth keeping," Cooper replied, settling into the chair that Bill had just vacated. The leather was still warm. "Anything I should know about?" Bill shrugged, picking up his lunchbox. "Pretty quiet today, though I've been seeing more of those bikers hanging around after dark. Nothing serious yet, but keep your eyes open." Cooper nodded, his face showing no reaction. 4 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that showing concern often invited trouble. "Thanks for the heads up. Have a good night." After Bill left, Cooper began his first rounds. His footsteps echoed off the warehouse walls as he walked the perimeter, checking doors and noting anything out of place. The job wasn't exciting, but it helped pay the bills while he figured out his next move. His wife Sarah had been supportive when he decided not to re-enlist, especially with their daughter Emily starting school soon. They needed stability, and Phoenix, with its large veteran community, seemed like the right place to build a new life. Around midnight, the familiar rumble of motorcycles caught his attention. Cooper watched from the shadows as 3 bikes cruised past the main gate, their riders taking longer looks than necessary at the property. Their leather vests displayed patches he didn't recognize, but their behavior set off warning signals in his mind. Cooper pulled out his small notebook and wrote down the time and description of the bikes. It was his 3rd week on the job, and this was the 4th time he'd seen these particular riders. They always appeared after midnight, always rode the same pattern around the complex, and always seemed to be studying the layout. His training kicked in automatically. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that patterns were important. Enemy forces would observe a location for days or weeks before making a move. These bikers were doing the same thing, whether they realized it or not. Walking back to the security office, Cooper pulled up the camera feeds from the previous nights. He hadn't mentioned his concerns to anyone yet. There was no point in raising alarms without proper intel. The cameras showed the same bikes, same time, different nights. They were getting bolder, riding closer to the gates each time. Cooper took another sip of his coffee and began documenting everything in the security log. His precise military handwriting filled the page as he noted times, descriptions, and patterns. If something was brewing, he wanted a paper trail. The rest of his shift passed quietly. He completed his rounds, checked the locks twice more, and kept an eye on the cameras. The bikers didn't return that night, but Cooper knew they would be back. His gut told him they were working up to something, and his gut had saved his life more than once in the service. As dawn approached and the sky began to lighten, Cooper gathered his things and prepared for the morning shift change. He'd mentioned the bikers to his supervisor in his weekly report, but for now, he'd watch and wait. That's what Special Forces had taught him. Patience and observation were often the best weapons. Walking to his car, Cooper felt the weight of his new responsibility. He wasn't just protecting empty buildings. He was protecting people's livelihoods, their businesses, their dreams. It might not be Afghanistan, but the mission was still important. And James Cooper had never failed a mission. 3 nights later, the rumbling of motorcycles filled the warehouse district again. This time, Marcus "Tank" Thompson led his night riders straight to the main gate of Phoenix Central Storage. Tank was a large man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. He didn't like changes to his territory, and the new security guard was becoming a problem. "That's the one," Tank said to his group, pointing at Cooper, who stood calmly under the security office light. "Mr. Military Man thinks he owns these streets now." The night riders had been using the warehouse district for their street races for 2 years. Every Saturday night, dozens of bikes would gather in the empty lots, racing for money and respect. Tank made good money from these races, taking a cut from every bet placed. But now, this new guard was watching too closely. Cooper observed the group from his position. 8 bikes, 12 riders. Some carried metal chains wrapped around their waists, trying to look threatening. He took mental notes of each face, each bike, just as he'd done with potential threats in Afghanistan. His hand didn't move toward his phone or radio, not yet. First, he needed to understand their intentions. "Evening, gentlemen," Cooper called out, his voice steady and professional. "The complex is closed. I'll have to ask you to move along." Tank revved his engine, the sound echoing off the warehouse walls. "Public street, soldier boy. We can park wherever we want." Cooper didn't react to the taunt. Instead, he walked closer, stopping at a distance that gave him room to maneuver if needed. His movements were casual but calculated, positioning himself where the security cameras had the best view. "You're right about the street," Cooper agreed, surprising the bikers with his calm response. "But if you're planning anything involving these properties, we'll have a problem. I've already documented your previous visits and shared them with local law enforcement." Tank's face darkened with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by some rent-a-cop. "Are you threatening us, tough guy?" "Just having a professional conversation," Cooper replied, his eyes scanning the group continuously. He noticed how 3 riders had started spreading out, trying to flank him. Their amateur attempts at tactics almost made him smile. He faced much better in Kandahar. One of the younger riders, eager to impress Tank, gunned his engine and rode his bike right up to Cooper, stopping inches from his feet. The security guard didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started recording. "That's assault with a deadly weapon," Cooper stated matter-of-factly, his phone capturing everything. "Want to try for more charges, or would you like to call it a night?" Tank watched the interaction with growing frustration. This wasn't going according to plan. The guard was supposed to be scared, supposed to back down like all the others before him. Instead, he was standing there like he was in control of the situation. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Tank growled, dismounting his bike. "Let's see how tough you are without your phone." Before Tank could take 3 steps, Cooper's voice cut through the night air. "Police response time to this location is 4 minutes. I called them when you first arrived. That was 3 minutes ago." As if on cue, distant sirens began to wail. The younger riders immediately looked nervous, some already starting their bikes. Tank stood frozen, realizing he'd underestimated his opponent. "Next time, do your homework better," Cooper advised, still recording. "I'm not your average security guard. I fought smarter enemies than you, and I always come prepared." The sound of sirens grew louder. Tank spat on the ground but quickly got back on his bike. "This isn't over, soldier boy." "Actually, it is," Cooper replied. "Because next time, I press charges." The night riders roared away just as the first police car turned into the street. Cooper had already prepared his statement and had the video ready to share. As he spoke with the officers, he knew Tank's threat wasn't empty. The bikers would be back, but that's exactly what he was counting on. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that sometimes you had to let the enemy make the first move to win the bigger battle. The night wasn't over yet, and James Cooper had a feeling things were about to get much more interesting. The weekend passed quietly, but Cooper knew better than to relax. A decade in special forces had taught him that silence often came before a storm. He spent his Sunday afternoon at home, playing with his daughter Emily in their small backyard, but his mind kept drifting back to Tank and his threats. "You're worried about something," his wife Sarah said that evening, after they put Emily to bed. She knew the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before deployments. "Just some trouble at work," Cooper replied, not wanting to concern her. "Nothing I can't handle." Monday night's shift started normally. Cooper arrived early, checked the security cameras, and began his rounds. The warehouse district was quiet except for the occasional truck making late deliveries. Around 1 a.m., he noticed something different. The lock on the back gate had scratch marks around it. Cooper approached carefully, staying in the shadows. His instincts told him this wasn't random vandalism. Someone had tried to pick this lock recently, probably within the last hour. He pulled out his flashlight and examined the ground, finding fresh oil spots from a motorcycle. The sound of engines came from 2 different directions. Cooper smiled grimly. a classic pincer movement, but poorly executed. He quickly moved to a better position, his back against the warehouse wall, giving him clear views of both approaches. 3 bikes appeared from the east, while 2 more came from the west. Tank wasn't among them. These were younger riders, probably sent to prove themselves. They killed their engines and dismounted, carrying metal pipes and chains. Come out, soldier boy," one of them called, trying to sound tough, but his voice betraying his nervousness. Tank sends his regards. Cooper spoke into his radio, making sure they could hear him. "Security to dispatch, we have 5 intruders on property, armed and hostile. Police have been notified." He hadn't actually called the police yet. This was a test to see their reaction. 2 of the younger riders immediately backed away. They hadn't signed up for serious trouble, but the leader, wearing a red bandana, urged them to stay. "He's bluffing." Tank says he always bluffs. "Your first mistake," Cooper called out, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls, making it hard to pinpoint his location, was believing Tank knows anything about military tactics. A metallic clang rang out as one of the riders accidentally hit his pipe against a dumpster, revealing his position. Cooper shook his head. These weren't fighters, just kids playing tough guy. "Your second mistake," he continued, moving silently between shadows, "was coming here without proper reconnaissance. There are 27 cameras covering this area. Every move you make is being recorded." This time, 3 of the riders moved back toward their bikes. The red bandana leader was losing control of the situation. "Stop being scared," he shouted. "There's 5 of us and only 1 of him." "Your third and biggest mistake," Cooper said, now behind them, making them spin around in surprise, "was not checking my background. 8 years, Special Forces, 4 tours in Afghanistan, advanced close quarters combat training." The red bandana leader swung his chain, but his movement was telegraphed and clumsy. Cooper stepped inside his reach, swept his leg, and had him face down with his arm locked behind his back in 2 smooth movements. The chain clattered harmlessly to the ground. "I could dislocate your shoulder right now," Cooper said calmly, applying just enough pressure to make his point. "Instead, I'm going to give you a choice. Leave now, tell Tank his plan failed, or wait here for the police who are actually on their way this time." The remaining riders scrambled for their bikes. The red bandana leader, released from Cooper's hold, stumbled to his feet and ran without looking back. In less than a minute, the warehouse district was quiet again. Cooper collected the dropped weapons as evidence, documented everything in his log, and called his supervisor to report the incident. He knew this wasn't over. This was just Tank's first attempt. The real challenge would come when Tank realized he needed to handle this personally. As Cooper finished his report, he couldn't help but feel a familiar surge of adrenaline. Part of him had missed this kind of excitement since leaving the service, but another part knew that the next confrontation would be much more serious. Tank wouldn't send boys to do a man's job again. The next evening, Cooper arrived at work to find his supervisor, Mike Sullivan, waiting for him in the security office. The older man's face was creased with concern as he handed Cooper a thick envelope. "This came for you today," Sullivan said. "No return address." Inside the envelope were photos of Cooper's house, his wife picking up Emily from school, and his family at the local grocery store. A note written in rough handwriting read, "Time to quit your job, soldier boy." Cooper's face remained calm, but his jaw tightened slightly. He'd dealt with intimidation tactics before, but bringing his family into it crossed a line. Still, he knew showing anger was exactly what Tank wanted. "I'm calling the police," Sullivan said, reaching for the phone. "Not yet," Cooper replied, studying the photos carefully. "This is what Tank wants, to make us react, change our routines, show fear." He pointed to details in the photos. These were taken from a car, not a motorcycle. Tank has friends helping him. Sullivan shook his head. "James, you've got a family. Nobody would blame you for walking away from this security job. If I walk away, Tank wins. He'll know intimidation works, and the next security guard will face the same thing." Cooper pulled out his phone and called Sarah. "Hey, honey," he said when she answered. "Remember that backup plan we talked about? Time to put it in motion." After hanging up, he explained to Sullivan, "My wife's taking Emily to stay with her sister in Tucson for a few days. We prepared for this possibility." Later that night, Cooper noticed something odd during his rounds. A motorcycle was parked on the street, leaning too far on its kickstand. Looking closer, he saw fresh oil drops leading away from it. This was a setup. Cooper moved quietly along the warehouse wall, scanning the shadows. His training told him this was an ambush, but a poorly planned one. The oil trail was too obvious, and the bike was placed too conveniently. Having engine trouble, he called out to the seemingly empty lot. A figure stepped out from behind a dumpster, one of Tank's older members, a man with a gray beard and a limp. "Yeah, bike just died on me. Don't suppose you could help?" "Strange place for it to break down," Cooper replied, staying well back. "Right in front of my warehouse, right after someone threatened my family." The older biker shrugged. "Don't know nothing about that, just need some help with my bike." Cooper heard the faint scuff of boots on concrete behind him, at least two people trying to circle around. Amateur move, they were wearing heavy biker boots that made stealth impossible. "Here's what's going to happen," Cooper announced loudly. "The three men behind the shipping containers, the two trying to sneak up behind me, and you're all going to leave. Now." The gray-bearded biker's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected Cooper to detect all of them. "Or," Cooper continued, "you can try what you're planning. But remember, I've already called in your license plate, the security cameras are recording, and this time, I'm pressing charges." "You think you're so smart," a voice growled from the shadows. "Tank's got friends everywhere. Cops, judges. And I got every threat, every photo, every attempt at intimidation documented and backed up to 3 different locations." Cooper countered. "If anything happens to me or my family, it all goes public. Every name, every face, every crime." There was silence for a moment, then the sound of retreating footsteps. The gray-bearded biker straightened up, no longer pretending to be interested in his motorcycle. "Tank's not going to like this," he warned. "Tank's running out of options," Cooper replied. "Tell them he's got 2 choices now. Walk away or escalate and lose everything." His call. After they left, Cooper collected the motorcycle's license plate number and added it to his growing file of evidence. He knew Tank would be furious when he heard how his plan failed. The next move would be desperate, probably violent, and definitely soon. Cooper smiled grimly as he completed his rounds. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that desperate enemies were dangerous, but they also made mistakes. Tank was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 2 nights later, Tank made his move. It started with a power outage that plunged the entire warehouse complex into darkness. Cooper was in the security office when the screens went black and the emergency lights kicked in. "Right on schedule," Cooper muttered, checking his watch. He'd been expecting something like this since his last confrontation with Tank's men. In the military, he'd learned that when subtle tactics fail, enemies often resort to brute force. The backup generator should have started automatically, but it remained silent. Cooper pulled out his flashlight and headed to the generator room, already knowing what he'd find. Someone had tampered with it earlier that day, probably during the afternoon shift change when security was lightest. The rumble of motorcycles echoed through the darkness. Not just a few this time. It sounded like Tank had brought his entire crew. Cooper counted at least 15 distinct engines, their headlights sweeping across the warehouse walls like searching spotlights. "Cooper!" Tank's voice boomed across the empty lot. "No cameras, no backup power, no witnesses. Just you and us. Come out and face me like a man." Cooper smiled in the darkness. Tank thought he'd created the perfect trap, but he'd actually done exactly what Cooper had anticipated. In Afghanistan, Cooper had learned that the best way to deal with a superior force was to let them think they had the advantage. "I'm here, Tank," Cooper called out, his voice calm and controlled. "But before we start anything, you should know that your power outage triggered an automatic alert to the police. They're already on their way." Tank's laugh was harsh. "You're lying. We cut the phone lines and cell signals are being jammed. You got no way to call for help." "Who said anything about phones?" Cooper replied. "Welcome to the digital age, Tank. Everything's automated now." This wasn't entirely true. Cooper had actually arranged this protocol with the police after the threats against his family. Any power outage at the warehouse would bring an immediate response, but Tank didn't need to know that. Motorcycle engines revved aggressively as the riders grew impatient. Cooper could see their outlines moving in the darkness, trying to surround the building. They thought they were being stealthy, but to Cooper's trained eyes, they might as well have been carrying flares. Last chance, soldier boy. Tank shouted. Walk away from the job, or we do this the hard way. Cooper had positioned himself near a side entrance, where the building's architecture created a natural bottleneck. If they wanted to reach him, they'd have to come through a narrow passage where numbers wouldn't matter. You know, Tank. Cooper projected his voice to echo off the walls, making it hard to pinpoint his location. In Special Forces, they taught us something important about overwhelming force. Want to know what it is? Shut up and fight. Tank was getting angry now, his frustration evident. They taught us that overwhelming force is useless if you can't bring it to bear on your target. Cooper's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, kind of like having 15 bikers who can only approach 2 at a time. As if to prove his point, 2 riders gunned their engines and charged through the narrow passage. Cooper was ready. He triggered the emergency fire sprinklers he'd modified earlier, spraying the concrete with water and soap. Both bikes went down instantly, their riders sliding harmlessly into the wall. Shouts of surprise and anger filled the night. Tank was losing control of his crew. Some riders were backing away, not willing to risk their expensive bikes on the slippery ground. You're not as smart as you think, Cooper. Tank's voice had an edge of desperation now. This isn't over. In the distance, police sirens began to wail. Cooper checked his watch again, right on time. Actually, Tank, it is over. You just don't know it yet. Cooper's voice was almost sympathetic. The question is, how do you want it to end? With handcuffs or with dignity? Tank's answer was lost in the roar of engines as several riders fled into the night. But Cooper knew Tank wouldn't run. Men like Tank never did. The real confrontation was still coming, but now it would be on Cooper's terms. As police sirens grew louder, most of Tank's crew scattered into the night. Only Tank himself and 4 of his most loyal riders remained, their bikes forming a semicircle in front of the warehouse entrance. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the wet pavement, making the scene look like something from an old Western standoff. Your boys are running, Tank, Cooper said, stepping into view but staying within the covered area. Smart of them. They know this ends badly for anyone who stays. Tank dismounted his bike, his massive frame towering in the dim light. He pulled off his leather jacket and tossed it aside, revealing arms covered in military tattoos. You think you're the only one with combat training, soldier boy? I was Marines, Force Recon. 2 tours in Iraq. Cooper nodded slowly. This explained a lot about Tank's leadership and tactics. Then you should know better than this. Is a warehouse territory really worth destroying everything you've built? This stopped being about territory when you humiliated my crew. Tank's voice echoed off the warehouse walls, his remaining men spread out trying to flank Cooper's position. Cooper kept his voice calm and professional. Last chance? Tank. Your crew's mostly gone. Police are almost here, and I got enough evidence to put you away for years. Walk away now, find somewhere else to race, and we all go home tonight. Tank's response was to charge forward, moving faster than a man his size should be able to. His first swing was a feint, military training showing through. Cooper recognized the tactic and sidestepped, avoiding both the feint and the real punch that followed. Not bad, Cooper acknowledged, maintaining his defensive stance. Force Recon teaches good hand-to-hand, but Special Forces teaches better. One of Tank's men tried to rush Cooper from behind. Without looking, Cooper kicked backward, catching the man's knee and sending him sprawling. Tank used the distraction to close in, throwing a combination of punches that would have overwhelmed an ordinary security guard. But Cooper wasn't ordinary. He slipped the first 2 punches and blocked the third, his movements efficient and economical. You're telegraphing your left, Tank. They teach you better than that in the Corps. Tank growled in frustration and charged again. This time, Cooper didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into Tank's rush, using the bigger man's momentum against him. A quick sweep of the leg, a shift of balance, and Tank crashed into the wet pavement. The remaining 3 riders moved in with chains and pipes. Cooper's training kicked into overdrive. He moved like water between them, never staying still long enough to be hit. One swing of a chain met empty air. A pipe meant for Cooper's head instead hit another rider's shoulder. In less than 30 seconds, 2 more riders were on the ground, groaning and disarmed. The last one backed away, hands raised in surrender. Tank got to his feet, spitting water and fury. "Fight me straight up, you coward. 1-on-1. "This isn't a boxing match, Tank," Cooper replied, still in his defensive stance. "This is about going home safe. Everyone going home safe." Tank charged one last time, throwing everything he had into a massive right hook. Cooper slipped inside the punch and applied a simple joint lock, the same one he'd used to train new recruits in Afghanistan. Tank's momentum did the rest, and the big man found himself face down, arm twisted behind his back, unable to move without causing himself pain. "It's over," Cooper said firmly, maintaining the hold with minimal pressure. "You're a Marine. You know when a battle's lost. Don't throw away your life over this." The sound of police cars pulling into the warehouse complex filled the night air. Tank's last remaining man dropped his weapon and put his hands up as flashlights began sweeping the area. "You could have ended this differently," Tank said through gritted teeth. Cooper eased up on the hold but stayed ready. "Yeah, I could have. Could have hurt you, pressed harder charges, made things worse. Instead, I'm giving you a chance to keep your dignity, because that's what one veteran owes another." As the police moved in to take control of the scene, Cooper saw something change in Tank's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of how far he'd strayed from his own military values. Sometimes, Cooper knew the hardest battles weren't fought with fists or weapons, but with wisdom and restraint. The next morning's sunrise painted the warehouse district in shades of orange and gold. Police cars were still present, their lights now off as officers finished processing the scene. Cooper sat on a bench outside the security office, giving his statement to Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had been following the case since the first incident. "So you're telling me," Rodriguez said, reviewing her notes, "that you knew they would cut the power, and you prepared for it?" Cooper nodded, sipping from a cup of coffee that one of the officers had brought him. "In the military, we learned to think 3 steps ahead. Tank's crew had tried everything else. A night attack was their logical next move." The detective shook her head in amazement. "And the modified sprinkler system?" "Simple preparation," Cooper explained. "Water and soap, harmless but effective. Nobody got seriously hurt, and that was the goal." Nearby, Tank sat in the back of a police car, his face a mixture of anger and something else. Maybe respect, maybe regret. His remaining men had already been taken to the station. Through the car window, Tank caught Cooper's eye and gave a slight nod. Sullivan, Cooper's supervisor, arrived looking worried and relieved at the same time. "James, the company owner's on his way. He wants to talk to you personally." He glanced at the detective. "Are we in any legal trouble here?" Rodriguez closed her notebook. Actually, Mr. Cooper's actions were textbook perfect. He documented everything, used reasonable force, and prevented property damage. If anything, the company owes him a thank you. As if on cue, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Richard Chen, the owner of Phoenix Central Storage, stepped out looking surprisingly calm for someone whose property had just been the scene of a confrontation. "Mr. Cooper," Chen said, walking over, "I've been reading the preliminary reports. You protected my property without causing any damage, prevented what could have been a serious criminal incident, and did it all while following proper security protocols." Cooper stood up, straightening his uniform. "Just doing my job, sir." Chen smiled. "No, you get much more than that. Which is why I want to offer you a new position. Head of security for all my properties in Phoenix. Full benefits, substantial raise, and authority to implement any security measures you see fit." Cooper blinked in surprise. Sullivan grinned and patted him on the back. "That's not all," Detective Rodriguez added. "The department would like to consult with you about improving security in other industrial areas. Your military experience and handling of this situation, we could learn a lot." Before Cooper could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Hey, honey," he answered. "Everything's okay now. You and Emily can come home." "We already are," Sarah replied. "Your friend Mike told us it was safe. Emily's been telling everyone at school that her daddy's a superhero." Cooper couldn't help but smile. No superhero, just a soldier doing his job. After finishing his statement, Cooper walked over to the police car where Tank was waiting to be transported. The former Marine looked up as Cooper approached. You could have ended this badly for me, Tank said quietly. Could have let your anger take over when I threatened your family. That wouldn't have helped anyone, Cooper replied. We both served, Tank. We both know what it's like to need the adrenaline, to miss the action. But there are better ways. Tank was silent for a moment. The guys who follow me, most of them are just lost, looking for something to belong to. I know some veteran organizations that could help, Cooper offered. Places that understand what it's like to come back and feel out of place, better than racing in warehouse districts. The police car started up, ready to take Tank to the station. Before they pulled away, Tank looked back at Cooper. You know, for a special forces guy, you're all right. As the sun rose higher over Phoenix, Cooper watched the police cars drive away. His phone buzzed again, a message from Sarah with a photo of Emily holding up a welcome home sign. Sometimes the biggest victories, he thought, weren't about who you beat, but about who you helped along the way. 3 months later, the warehouse district had changed dramatically. New security cameras dotted the buildings, motion sensor lights illuminated every corner, and regular police patrols kept the streets safe. In his new office, James Cooper looked over the security monitors with satisfaction. Another quiet night, said Mark, one of the new security guards Cooper had hired. Like Cooper, Mark was a veteran, Army Rangers, who needed a chance to use his skills in civilian life. Quiet is good, Cooper replied, checking the time. Almost end of shift. How's the new system working out? Mark nodded appreciatively. Those automated alerts you set up are amazing. Can't believe no one thought of this before. Cooper smiled, remembering how different things were just a few months ago. His promotion to head of security had allowed him to implement many changes he'd learned in special forces, not just better equipment, but better training and procedures too. The phone on his desk rang. It was Detective Rodriguez. Thought you'd want to know, she said when he answered. Tank's being released tomorrow. Good behavior and cooperation with our investigation of some other criminal activities in the area. Thanks for letting me know, Cooper replied. He'd been keeping track of Tank's situation through his contacts at the police department. He's asked to speak with you, Rodriguez added. Says he has a proposition. We vetted it. It's legitimate. Later that morning, after his shift ended, Cooper met Tank at a small diner near the police station. The former Marine leader looked different in regular clothes, smaller somehow, but also more at peace. Appreciate you meeting me, Tank said as Cooper sat down across from him, especially after everything that happened. Cooper ordered coffee and waited for Tank to continue. Remember what you said about veteran organizations? Tank asked. Well, I did some thinking in jail. Made some calls. Turns out there's a lot of guys like us who need direction. Cooper nodded, beginning to see where this was heading. I'm starting a motorcycle club, Tank continued. A legal one. For vets who need the brotherhood but don't want the trouble. We've got 20 members already, all former military. Could use someone with your experience as an advisor. Cooper studied Tank's face, seeing the sincerity there. And the racing? Going legitimate, Tank replied. We're working with the city to organize proper track events, safety equipment, permits, everything by the book. The adrenaline rush without the risk. Before Cooper could respond, the diner's door opened and Sarah walked in with Emily. They had planned to meet for breakfast after his meeting. Emily's face lit up when she saw him. Daddy, she called out, then stopped short when she saw Tank. She remembered him from the news stories. But Tank surprised them all by standing up and offering a proper military salute to Emily. Your dad's a real hero, little lady. Taught me, and a lot of other guys, an important lesson. Emily beamed with pride, and Sarah gave Cooper a knowing smile. This was why she'd fallen in love with him, his ability to turn enemies into allies, to find solutions where others saw only problems. I'll help with the club, Cooper decided. But we do it right. No shortcuts, no exceptions. Tank grinned. Wouldn't have it any other way, soldier boy. As they finished their breakfast, Cooper looked around the table. His family was safe, his career was thriving, and he'd helped turn a potential tragedy into something positive. The skills he'd learned in special forces, patience, strategy, and understanding people, had served him well in civilian life. You know, Tank said as they were leaving, some of the guys still can't believe how you handled everything. They expected some kind of action movie fight scene. Cooper laughed. The best victories are the ones where nobody has to lose. Outside, the morning sun shone bright over Phoenix. Emily held both Cooper's and Sarah's hands, swinging between them as they walked to their car. In the distance, the warehouse district stood peaceful and secure. Later that day, Cooper would interview more veterans for security positions, review plans for the motorcycle club's first legal race event, and continue building bridges between former soldiers and the community they served. But for now, he was just James Cooper, husband, father, and proof that sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who know how to make peace.